The coal burns where it touches her eyelids. Kia is 26 years old, and she can feel the cosmetic paste stinging the cuts that ring her eyes. Cuts were made deliberately that morning by the household cosmetic, who explained that the small wounds would make the coal penetrate deeper and would make her eyes appear larger and more lustrous for the inspection that will determine her fate. She was, until 37 days ago, the daughter of a Nubian chieftain, promised in marriage to the son of a neighboring king, educated in the poetry of her people and the administration of the household she would one day manage. Now she kneels on polished granite in the reception hall of Lord Senmet, overseer of the royal granaries, a man whose wealth is measured in fields that stretch beyond the horizon and slaves who number in the hundreds. Around her, 11 other women kneel in identical positions, wrists bound behind their backs, bodies oiled until their skin gleams in the lamplight, and faces painted with cosmetics designed to enhance their value. They are merchandise. They are being evaluated. Lord Senmet walks among them slowly, his linen robes brushing against skin as he passes, his eyes assessing flesh, the way she has seen cattle traders assess livestock. He is perhaps 50 years old, his body soft from decades of wealth, his face bearing the particular expression of someone who has never been denied anything he wanted. Behind him, his steward takes notes on papyrus, recording observations that will influence which women go where and which purposes each will serve. This one, Senmet says, stopping before Kia Nubian. The features are good. The body is... He gestures, and a servant steps forward to pull away the thin cloth that provides her only covering. Acceptable, strong enough for labor, refined enough for display. What is her background? Chieftain's daughter, my lord. Captured in the Southern Campaign. She is literate in her own tongue and has some Egyptian literacy. The word carries weight that limits her uses but increases certain values. She could serve in administrative capacities. She could be trained for the innermost household. The innermost household. Kia has been in Egypt long enough to understand what that phrase means. The women who serve there do not merely clean and cook. They provide services that the formal wife cannot or will not provide. They bear children who will never inherit but who will carry their father's blood. They exist in a space between slave and concubine, protected by proximity to power but destroyed by that same proximity when power's attention shifts elsewhere. I will take this one personally, Senmet continues. Prepare her for my quarters this evening. The standard preparation. The standard preparation. Another phrase she has learned to fear. It involves bathing, perfuming, and the application of oils and cosmetics that will make her body more pleasing to touch, more aromatic to smell, and more visually appealing in the lamplight where she will be expected to perform. A woman approaches, older, perhaps 40, wearing the simple dress of a senior household servant, but carrying herself with an authority that suggests her position is more complex than her clothing indicates. She takes Kia's arm and guides her to her feet with a grip that is firm but not cruel. Come, the woman says in Egyptian that carries a Nubian accent. I will explain what you need to understand. She is led from the reception hall through corridors that grow progressively more private, more richly decorated, and more clearly belonging to the innermost household that will be her new world. The woman walking beside her says nothing until they reach a small chamber where bathing implements have been arranged. My name is Merit, the woman says. I was where you are 22 years ago. I am going to tell you things that will determine whether you survive the next year or whether you become one of the women we never speak of again. What you are about to learn has been systematically excluded from the histories that celebrate ancient Egypt as a civilization of grandeur and achievement. The pyramids, the temples, and the magnificent tombs of the pharaohs, these are what we remember. The monuments tell stories of divine kings and eternal life, of power wielded righteously and culture preserved across millennia. But monuments are built by hands that history does not record. Palaces are maintained by bodies that hieroglyphics do not name, and the great households of Egyptian nobles. The estates that produced the wealth that funded the monuments were sustained by enslaved women whose experiences have been erased from the historical record as thoroughly as if they had never existed. Tonight, you will learn what happened inside those households. You will learn about the systems that governed enslaved women's lives, the hierarchies that determined their fates, and the methods of control that were refined over centuries of practice. You will learn about the innermost household and what service actually meant there. You will learn about Kia, a Nubian chieftain's daughter who entered the household of Lord Senmet as property, and who spent the next 30 years navigating a system designed to consume women like her. You will learn what she endured, what she witnessed, and what she eventually became when the system that should have destroyed her instead transformed her into something else entirely. Subscribe if you want to understand the full complexity of ancient Egyptian society, not the simplified version that focuses on monuments and mysteries, but the human reality of a civilization built on the labor and suffering of enslaved people. Comment below telling me where you are watching from, because Kia is about to enter the innermost household of one of Egypt's most powerful nobles. And I'm going to tell you exactly what that entrance required. But before I describe what happened to her that first night and in the years that followed, I need to take you back. I need to explain how Egyptian slavery functioned, why enslaved women faced particular horrors, and what the innermost household actually was. Because you cannot understand what Kia experienced without understanding the system that shaped her existence. Egyptian slavery was not a single institution, but a spectrum of unfreedom that varied enormously depending on circumstances. At one end were debt bondsmen, Egyptians who had fallen into temporary servitude to pay off obligations, who retained legal rights and could eventually purchase their freedom. At the other end were war captives from foreign lands, Nubians, Libyans, Asiatics, and peoples whose conquest had stripped them of all status and delivered them into a bondage that was permanent and hereditary. Women occupied particular positions within this spectrum. Female slaves were valued for multiple capacities simultaneously as laborers who could perform domestic and agricultural work, as producers who could bear children to increase a household slave population, and as objects of sexual access whose bodies belonged to their owners as completely as any other property. The Egyptian language had multiple words for these different functions. A hemet was a female servant who performed domestic labor. A segment was a woman designated for sexual use by her owner. A moret was a woman whose primary purpose was producing children. Many enslaved women were classified under multiple terms simultaneously, expected to fulfill all these functions as their owners demanded. The great households of the nobility organized these women into hierarchies that determined their living conditions, their daily experiences, and their prospects for whatever limited advancement the system permitted. At the bottom were field workers and general laborers, women who slept in communal quarters and whose bodies were available to overseers and fellow slaves without restriction. Above them were domestic servants who worked within the house itself, whose conditions were somewhat better, but whose bodies remained property accessible to any man with sufficient authority. At the top, if top is the appropriate word for a hierarchy of degradation, were the women of the innermost household. These were the personal servants of the Lord himself, selected for beauty, intelligence, and the capacity to provide services that went beyond simple labor. They slept in quarters adjacent to the Lord's chambers. They ate better food, wore better clothing, and received medical attention that other slaves were denied. They were in some ways the most privileged of the enslaved, but their privilege was inseparable from their function. They existed to serve the Lord's personal needs, not merely sexual needs, though those were central, but also the needs for entertainment, for companionship, and for the particular kind of submission that made powerful men feel more powerful. Their proximity to power protected them from some abuses while exposing them to others. They were simultaneously the most valued and the most vulnerable women in the household. This was the world Kia was entering. This was the system that would shape her existence for the next 3 decades. Now, let us return to the bathing chamber, where Merritt is preparing Kia for her first night in Lord Senmet's service. You have a choice. Merritt said her hands were working oil into Kia's skin with practiced efficiency. Not the choice you want. Not the choice to leave or to refuse or to be treated as a human being rather than property, but a choice nonetheless. What choice? How you respond, how you position yourself, whether you remain a victim of this system or learn to navigate it, to use it to eventually make it serve purposes. It was never designed to serve. Kia looked at the older woman. Merritt's face bore the subtle signs of long-suffering lines around the mouth that suggested years of suppressing expression, a carefulness in the eyes that came from constant vigilance. But there was also something else: confidence, the bearing of someone who had achieved a position of security within a system that offered no security. You survived, Kia said. 22 years I did more than survive. I rose. I am now the senior woman of the innermost household. I determine which servants serve where and which new acquisitions are assigned to which purposes. I have influence that my position as a slave should make impossible. How? By understanding that Lord Senmet is a man with needs that go beyond the physical. He wants more than bodies to use. He wants intelligence to consult, perspective to consider, and companionship that does not require the pretense of equality, but that offers genuine engagement. You became his advisor. I became necessary. There is a difference. Advisors can be dismissed. Necessary people are protected because their absence creates problems. Merritt's hands moved lower, applying oil with clinical precision to areas that would be touched that night. Tonight, he will use you. This is not optional, and it is not negotiable. But how you respond to that use will determine your trajectory. Cry, beg, resist. You mark yourself as someone who must be broken before she can be useful. Accept, engage, and demonstrate value. You mark yourself as someone worth investing in. You want me to pretend to enjoy it? I want you to survive it. And I want you to understand that survival in this system requires more than endurance. It requires strategy. It requires the willingness to sacrifice what cannot be preserved in order to protect what can be. Kia absorbed this. The advice was monstrous counsel for collaboration with her own degradation, but it was also realistic. She had seen what happened to women who resisted too openly. She had seen the bodies carried from the slave quarters, the faces marked by beatings that served as warnings to others. "What do you want from me?" she asked. "You are not doing this from kindness. You have purposes." Merritt smiled slightly, the first expression of genuine emotion Kia had seen from her. "I am 44 years old. I have perhaps 10 years of usefulness remaining before age makes me expendable. I need successors, women I have trained, who owe their positions to me, who will protect my interests when I can no longer protect myself. You want me to be your protege. I want you to be my investment. Your intelligence, your education, your capacity to learn. These are valuable. Lord Senmet collects valuable things. If I present you as a valuable acquisition that I have cultivated, my judgment is validated. My position is strengthened. And if I fail, then you are simply another woman who could not adapt to her circumstances. Your failure reflects on you, not on me. I lose nothing except the time I have invested." The calculation was cold, but Kia understood it. Merritt was not offering friendship or protection. She was offering a transaction guidance in exchange for future loyalty, investment in exchange for eventual returns. It was the first of many such transactions that would define Kier's rise through the household hierarchy. "Teach me," Kier said. "I will learn." The first night was exactly what Merritt had warned her it would be. Lord Senmet was neither gentle nor deliberately cruel. He was simply a man exercising rights over property, satisfying appetites with merchandise that had been prepared for his consumption. He did not ask what Kia wanted or felt. He did not care. She was there to serve a purpose, and she served it. When it was over, she lay in the darkness of the chamber assigned to her, a small room adjacent to the Lord's quarters. Better than the communal spaces, but clearly belonging to someone whose presence was conditional on continued usefulness. She did not cry. Crying would accomplish nothing and might be reported by other slaves whose loyalty was to their own survival rather than to sisterhood among the enslaved. Instead, she thought, she analyzed what had happened, what she had observed, what she might do differently next time to improve her position. This was the strategy Merritt had described, treating each encounter not as an assault to be endured, but as information to be processed, data that would help her navigate the system more effectively. She learned over the following weeks the particular preferences and patterns of Lord Senmet. He liked women who displayed intelligence, but not too much independence. He enjoyed conversation, but not argument. He wanted submission that felt voluntary, rather than coerced the illusion of willing participation that validated his self-image as a generous master rather than a rapist. She learned to provide this illusion. She learned to anticipate his moods, to know when he wanted silence and when he wanted engagement. To offer the particular kind of flattery that appealed to his vanity without seeming sycophantic. She learned, in short, to perform the role of the willing concubine, while maintaining inside herself a core of identity that the performance did not touch. Merritt observed her progress with the clinical assessment of an investor watching returns on capital. "Good," she said, after 1 month. "He has asked for you specifically 3 times this week. That is faster than most women achieve exclusivity." Exclusivity, the pattern where he stops, rotating through available women and focuses on a particular favorite. It does not last forever. His attention will shift eventually. But while it lasts, you have opportunities. What opportunities? Access, proximity, the chance to overhear conversations, to observe dealings, to accumulate information about the household's operations. Information is power, even for slaves, especially for slaves. Kiara had already begun this accumulation. She paid attention when Senmet discussed business with visitors, when his steward reported on the estates, when correspondence was read aloud in her presence, because the Lord assumed a Nubian slave could not understand administrative Egyptian. But she could understand. Her education as a chieftain's daughter had included the languages of Egypt's southern trading partners. And she had expanded that knowledge rapidly during her captivity. She knew more than anyone realized. She was building a mental archive of information that might someday prove useful. Let me take you now through the years that followed. Because Kiara's transformation was not the work of weeks or months, but of decades. A slow accumulation of position, knowledge, and power that eventually made her something the system had never anticipated. The first year established her as a favorite. Lord Senmont called for her frequently, trusted her with small confidences, permitted her access to spaces where other slaves were forbidden. She used this access to learn everything she could about the household's operations, which overseers were corrupt, which servants could be trusted, where the vulnerabilities in the administrative structure lay. The second year brought pregnancy. This was expected. Enslaved women in the innermost household were not given the contraceptive measures available to formal wives. Senmet wanted children, many children, heirs and nearers, who would extend his legacy even if they could not inherit his formal position. Kiara bore a son who was taken from her immediately and given to wet nurses in a separate section of the compound. "You will see him occasionally," Merritt explained, "but he is not your child in any meaningful sense. He belongs to the Lord, not to you. Your attachment to him will be used to control you if you permit it." Kiara understood. She suppressed the maternal instinct that screamed for her infant, transformed the love into something colder and more strategic. She would protect her son not through open devotion, but through the accumulation of power that would let her influence his fate. The third year brought a shift in the household dynamics. Merritt fell ill with a fever that would not break, and for 2 weeks she lay in the medical quarters while the other women of the innermost household maneuvered to claim her position. Kia used those 2 weeks to demonstrate that she was the obvious successor, not through aggression toward rivals, but through quiet competence that made her indispensable. When Merit recovered, she found that Kia had functionally taken over many of her duties. Rather than resenting this, she accelerated her protégé's advancement. "I am not going to live forever," she said. "Better that my position goes to someone I chose than to someone who simply grabbed it." By year 5, Kia was Merit's acknowledged second in command. By year 7, when Merit finally died of a recurrence of the fever, Kia stepped into her position as senior woman of the innermost household with a smoothness that suggested the transition had been inevitable. She was 33 years old. She had been a slave for 7 years, and she was now, in practical terms, one of the most powerful women in one of Egypt's wealthiest households. But power in a slave's hands was always conditional. She understood this. Senmet could strip her position with a word, could return her to the general labor pool, could sell her to buyers whose uses would be far worse than his own. Her power depended on his continued favor, and his favor depended on her continued usefulness. So she made herself more useful. She expanded her role from managing the innermost household to advising on administrative matters, using the information she had gathered to offer insights that the Lord's formal advisors could not provide. She cultivated relationships with the steward, the overseers, the other power centers in the household, building a network of mutual dependence. That would make her removal costly. She also began quietly to change things. The changes started small. Kia could not transform the system that had enslaved her. She was too embedded in it, too dependent on its continuation for her own position. But she could modify its worst excesses, could create space for survival where only destruction had existed before. She established informal rules for how new acquisitions to the innermost household would be treated. The standard preparation that had been performed on her, the cutting around the eyes, the oils designed to inflame sensitive tissue, the treatments that caused pain under the guise of enhancement, she quietly discontinued. Women entering the household now received preparation that was cosmetic rather than injurious. She created a system for rotating women through Senmet's attention rather than permitting him to focus destructively on single individuals. When his interest in a particular woman became too intense, too demanding, too likely to result in injury, Kia would redirect his attention elsewhere, would present new acquisitions whose novelty would capture his interest and give the endangered woman time to recover. She protected where she could the children born to enslaved women. Her own son had grown into a young man who held a minor administrative position in the household. Not the heir Senmet's legitimate children were, but educated, fed, protected from the worst possibilities of slave existence. She ensured that other women's children received similar consideration, that the pattern of taking infants from mothers and disposing of them carelessly was replaced by something more humane. These changes were invisible to those outside the household. From the exterior, nothing had changed. Lord Senmet still owned hundreds of slaves, still used women from his innermost household for purposes that would be called rape in any system that recognized enslaved women as human beings, still maintained all the structures of power that Egyptian nobility considered their right. But from the interior, Kia had transformed the lived experience of dozens of women. She had created paths to relative safety that had not existed before. She had made survival more likely for those who came after her. And she had done this while remaining a slave herself, while continuing to serve Senmet's personal needs, while performing the role of the valued concubine whose favor protected her position. The compromise was absolute. She could not save anyone without remaining complicit in the system that endangered them. This was the moral complexity of her transformation. She had become powerful by becoming useful to power. She protected others by maintaining a system that fundamentally could not protect anyone. She was simultaneously victim and collaborator, simultaneously liberator and oppressor. She was, in short, a transformer. Someone who changed the system from within without ever challenging its fundamental assumptions. Year 15 brought a crisis that tested everything Kier had built. Lord Senmet's eldest legitimate son, Kim Wasit, had come of age and was beginning to assert authority in the household. He was not his father, where Senmet was calculating and generally controlled in his exercise of power. Kamet was impulsive, cruel in ways that served no practical purpose, interested in inflicting suffering for its own sake rather than as a means to administrative ends. He also resented Kie, her position in the household, her influence over his father, her very existence as a visible symbol of his father's appetites. All of it offended him. He was the heir, the legitimate son, the future lord of the estates. She was a Nubian slave who had somehow accumulated power that should belong to proper Egyptians. "When my father dies," he told her during one encounter, "your position ends. I will have you transferred to the labor pool where you belong. Perhaps to the fields where Nubian animals should work. Perhaps to the overseer's quarters where you can service men who match your actual worth." "Your father is in excellent health," Kier replied, keeping her voice neutral. "That day may be decades away, or it may be sooner than you expect. Old men die suddenly, especially old men with complicated digestive systems, especially old men whose food passes through many hands before reaching their tables." The threat was explicit. Kawesa was suggesting poison and was warning her that her protector might be removed and that she would be the first to suffer when the transition occurred. Kia had prepared for this possibility. She had known for years that Senmet's death would end her protection, had known that the heir's hostility made her position untenable beyond the current lord's lifetime. She had accumulated resources, gold hidden in locations. Only she knew relationships with merchants who might help her escape if escape became necessary. Information about Kimet's own vulnerabilities that might serve as leverage, but she had not prepared for acceleration. She had not expected the heir to threaten patricide as a means of reaching her. She went to Lord Senmet that evening. She had not shared his bed in years. He had aged. His appetites had diminished, and she had successfully transitioned from favored concubine to valued advisor. But she still had access that others lacked. Could still speak to him in private without the observation of servants whose loyalties might be divided. "Your son threatens your life," she said directly. "He wants you dead so he can destroy me. And he is not patient enough to wait for natural causes." Senmet studied her. He was 70 now, his body failing in ways that Egyptian medicine could not address. His mind is still sharp, but his awareness of mortality is increasingly acute. "You have evidence. I have his words. He spoke to me explicitly about your food, about hands it passes through, and about how old men die suddenly. He is young and angry. Young men say things. He is your heir, and he is impatient. Impatient heirs have killed their fathers since time began." Senmet was silent for a long moment. Then he asked a question that surprised her. "What would you have me do?" It was an invitation, an acknowledgement that her advice was valued, that her judgment could influence the succession of one of Egypt's great households. Remove him from the succession. You have other sons, legitimate and otherwise. Designate a different heir, one whose temperament is more suited to the administration of vast estates. Send him to a distant position far from the household, where his impatience cannot endanger you or anyone else. You would benefit from this change. I would survive this change. My survival is bound to your survival. My advice serves your interests because your interests are my interests. It was the logic of the transaction that had defined their relationship from the beginning. Not love, not loyalty, but mutual benefit. Kia had made herself necessary, and necessity now demanded that she be protected. Senmet made his decision over the following weeks. Kemwise was appointed to an administrative position in the southern provinces, an honorable assignment, but far from the household and from the succession he had expected to inherit. A different son, one whose temperament aligned more closely with Senmet's administrative approach, was designated as heir. Kia had survived the crisis. She had, in fact, shaped the succession of a great household according to her recommendation. But she had also made an enemy who would remember and who would wait. Let me take you now to year 25, when the transformation was nearly complete. Lord Senmet had died 3 years earlier peacefully in his bed with Kia beside him, as she had been for more than 2 decades. The transition to his designated successor, his son Amenhotep, who had inherited his father's calculating nature, had gone smoothly. Kemet, still in the southern provinces, had raged at his disinheritance, but had been unable to do anything about it. Kir's position had evolved again. She was no longer the senior woman of the innermost household. That role had passed to younger women whom she had trained. She was now something unprecedented, an advisor whose counsel the new lord sought on matters ranging from estate management to political navigation. She was still technically a slave. Her status had never changed, but the practical reality of her position was so far removed from slavery's usual meaning that the word seemed almost absurd. She lived in comfortable quarters. She ate well, dressed well, and received medical attention that extended her life beyond what most women of her generation could expect. She had influence over the treatment of hundreds of other slaves, could protect those she chose to protect, and could shape the conditions of their existence. And she had done something that no one outside the household knew about. She had secured the futures of her children, not just her son, but also the 3 daughters she had borne during her years in the innermost household. Her son held an administrative position that would sustain him throughout his life. Her daughters had been placed in favorable circumstances. One married to a freeman merchant whose business prospered, one serving in a temple where her education was valued, and one attached to a noble household where her mother's connections ensured good treatment. They were not free. Freedom was not available to people born to slave mothers. But they were protected, positioned, and given futures that slavery's usual patterns would have denied them. This was Kir's true transformation, not the accumulation of personal power, though she had accumulated that. Not the modification of the household's worst practices, though she had achieved that too, but the creation of a legacy. Descendants who would carry something of her forward into generations she would never see. She was 51 years old. She had been a slave for 25 years, and she had become something the system had never anticipated. A slave who had bent the system toward purposes it was designed to prevent. The final years of Kir's life brought both culmination and complication. The complications came from Kamweset, who had never forgotten his disinheritance and who had never stopped blaming Kia for the loss of his birthright. From his position in the southern provinces, he had built alliances with officials who resented the current lord's administration. He had accumulated resources he had planned. When Amenhotep died suddenly from a fever that the physicians could not treat, Kemwa moved immediately. He arrived at the household within days, claiming authority as the eldest surviving son of the original lord. Presenting documents that he asserted gave him rights that the succession had improperly denied. The household's administration was thrown into chaos. The designated heir had been Amenhotep's own son, still a child. And regency arrangements had not been finalized. Kamweset exploited this uncertainty ruthlessly, positioning himself as the experienced administrator who could maintain order during the crisis. And one of his first acts was to order Kir's arrest. The slave who manipulated my father, who stole my inheritance, who has lived in luxury that her status never entitled her to. He announced it to the household. Her influence ends today. Her position ends today. She will be returned to the status she should never have been permitted to escape. Kia was 61 years old. She had survived in the household for 35 years through intelligence, strategy, and the cultivation of relationships that made her removal costly. But those relationships depended on the previous power structure, and that structure was collapsing. She was taken to the slave quarters, not the quarters she had occupied for decades, but the communal spaces where general laborers lived. She was stripped of her comfortable clothing and given the rough shifts of a common slave. She was, in every practical sense, returned to the position she had occupied on her first day in the household 35 years earlier. But she was not the same woman who had knelt on polished granite while Lord Senmit evaluated her value. She still had resources, hidden in locations that Kimbit's agents had not found. Relationships with people outside the household, merchants, officials, and priests who owed her favors or who had reasons to oppose Ket's assumption of power. Information about Kaiset himself. Vulnerabilities she had identified years earlier and stored for emergency use. And she had something else. The loyalty of the other slaves, the women she had protected, the conditions she had improved, and the paths to survival she had created, these had not been forgotten. The slave population of the household knew what Kier had done for them. They knew that her removal threatened the moderate treatment they had experienced under her influence. They would not rebel openly. Slaves who rebelled openly were destroyed. They would resist in the ways available to them. Roby conversations. Reported to interested parties and the thousand small sabotages that made the difference between a smoothly functioning estate and one plagued by constant friction. Kim Wessett's assumption of power was not going smoothly. The resolution came through channels that Kia had prepared decades earlier. The Temple of Ammon at Thebes had long-standing relationships with the great households of the nobility. Priests served as advisors, as educators, and as repositories of legal authority that could adjudicate disputes. And Kia had cultivated relationships with certain priests who valued her intelligence and who had benefited from information she had provided about the workings of noble households. One of these priests, a man named Userat, learned of Kier's arrest and Ket's seizure of power. He also learned of irregularities in the documents Kim Wessett had presented, irregularities that careful examination might reveal as forgeries. The user had brought these concerns to the temple's legal authorities. An investigation was initiated into the circumstances of Koset's claim to the household. During this investigation, Koset's power was suspended. His orders were subject to review, and his treatment of household members was scrutinized. The investigation took months. During those months, Kia remained in the slave quarters, but her treatment improved as Quizet's authority weakened. The other slaves protected her as she had protected them, sharing food, warning of dangers, and maintaining the network of mutual support that she had helped to create. The investigation's conclusion confirmed what Userhead had suspected. The documents Kemwes had presented were forged. His claim to authority was invalid. The proper succession regency for the child heir, with administration by officials appointed according to the previous Lord Eswell, was restored. Kame Waset was arrested, tried, and executed for forgery and attempted usurpation. His body was denied proper burial. His name was chiseled from any monuments that bore it. His existence was erased from official records with a thoroughness that Egyptian authorities applied to those who threatened social order. Kia was restored to her previous position, indeed, to an enhanced position. As the Regency Council valued her experience and sought her advice on household administration, she spent her remaining years as something approaching a formal administrator, a slave whose practical authority exceeded that of many free Egyptians. She died at 68, having lived longer than most women of her generation, having achieved more than the system that enslaved her had ever intended to permit. Her children survived her, protected by the positions she had secured for them. Her grandchildren, still unfree, still carrying the status that descended through enslaved mothers, nonetheless lived better lives because of what she had built, and the household itself was different. The changes she had instituted, the modest improvements to treatment, the systems for protecting vulnerable women, and the paths to relative safety within an institution fundamentally designed to destroy these survived her. The women who came after her benefited from structures she had created, even if they never knew her name. This was her legacy, not freedom. She never achieved freedom, never seriously pursued it, understanding that her power depended on remaining within the system rather than fleeing it. Not just as the system that had enslaved her continued, would continue for centuries and would consume countless women whose suffering would never be recorded. But change, incremental, insufficient. Compromise change that nonetheless made the lived experience of enslaved women in one household measurably better than it would otherwise have been. It was not enough. It could never be enough. But it was what she had achieved, and it was more than most people in her position ever achieved. What you have learned tonight challenges the image of ancient Egypt that monuments and museums present. We see the pyramids and think of architectural achievement. We see the tombs and think of spiritual devotion. We see the temples and think of religious dedication. We do not see the hands that built them, the bodies that maintained them, or the lives that were consumed in their creation and upkeep. Keir's story is not typical. Most enslaved women in Egyptian households did not rise to positions of influence. Most did not survive into old age. Most did not achieve the ability to protect others or to shape the conditions of their existence. Most simply endured until they could not endure any longer, then were replaced by new acquisitions from the southern campaigns or the eastern trade routes. But Keir's story reveals what was possible within the system. Both the paths to survival that intelligence and strategy could create, and the fundamental limitations that even the most successful navigation could not overcome. She remained a slave. Her children remained slaves. The system that had enslaved her continued unchanged in its fundamental nature. She had transformed her own circumstances and the circumstances of those she protected. She had not transformed the system itself. This is the tragedy that underlies her story. Not that she failed by any reasonable measure. She succeeded beyond any expectation, but that her success was individual rather than systemic. That the changes she created were local rather than general. That the same institutions that permitted her rise consumed countless other women whose potential was never permitted to develop. What Egyptian nobles did to enslaved women was worse than death. Not because the individual cruelties were worse than those practiced by other civilizations, though they were often terrible, but because the system was so comprehensive, so organized, and so thoroughly designed to extract value from human bodies while denying human dignity. The monuments that remain testify to the grandeur of Egyptian civilization. They do not testify to the cost of that grandeur, to the lives that were consumed in its creation, or to the women whose suffering was the foundation on which the temples were built. Remember this when you see images of ancient Egypt. Remember that every palace contained an innermost household. Remember that every great estate included hundreds of enslaved women whose experiences are lost because no one thought them worth recording. Remember that the history we inherit is incomplete, shaped by what the powerful chose to preserve and what they chose to suppress. Remember Kia. Remember the chieftain's daughter who became property, who navigated a system designed to destroy her, and who transformed herself into something the system had never anticipated. Remember that her transformation required compromise, collaboration with the very structures that oppressed her, performance of roles that violated her dignity, and acceptance of conditions that no human being should be required to accept. Remember that she protected others through these compromises, that the women who came after her in that household lived better lives because of what she had built, that her complicity was the price of whatever improvement she achieved. Remember that this is the moral complexity of survival in systems of oppression, that those who survive often do so through means that implicate them in the oppression itself, that the line between victim and collaborator is not as clear as we might wish it to be. Remember that Keir's story is one among thousands that were never recorded, that for every enslaved woman who rose to influence, countless others were consumed without trace, that the system's cost cannot be measured by its rare exceptions. Remember what Egyptian nobles did to enslaved women. Remember the innermost household and what service they're required to do. Remember the hierarchies of degradation that organized female suffering into categories of use and value. Remember that civilization's achievements are built on human costs that we too often prefer to forget. Subscribe if you want more hidden histories revealed. Comment below telling me where you are watching from. Share this video with anyone who thinks they understand ancient Egypt from museums and documentaries that show only the monuments, because the monuments do not tell the whole story. The monuments cannot speak for those whose labor built them. The monuments preserve the names of the powerful while erasing the existence of the enslaved. Remember, Kia? Remember the nameless thousands whose stories will never be told. Remember what the history you were taught chose to